Elwynn Taylor, and this is the outlook for the crop weather for 2013, a year that is following a year of serious drought. In fact, following the year of the first serious drought in the Corn Belt since 1988. We have been very concerned about droughts coming, and coming our way, we knew that they would eventually, even though crops are greatly improved during the past few years with higher yields and greater resistance to pests and greater resistance to drought. Everything seems to be improved, yet we are still dependent on the weather. When we look back a few years, we had great variability of crop yield. Some would refer to it as annual volatility of crop yield. The period of time from 1970 through 1995, that was the time of the very best of years when our crops reached up to their potential, and the worst of years when yields were cut in half with the droughts of 1983, 1988, and the floods of 93, as well as the first drought of that period, which was in 1974. So great years and poor years. It hasn't always been so. Sometimes we have had periods when the years were very, very consistent. During the past 150 years approximately, since we began keeping records of crop yields, we have seen 4 periods when we have had highly variable yields, from very good, reaching the potential for the crop, to very poor. And between those periods of high volatility, 18-year periods of very consistent yields, times when the yield varied almost nothing between years, except for the uptrend, thanks to the plant breeders and to the management of crops in our fields. But the winters were consistent, the summers were consistent. If you had a heating bill for the winter in the Midwest, it was probably the same winter after winter. And then came a 25-year period of warm winters and cold winters, warm summers and cold summers, great years for crops, poor years for crops, and then another period of consistent yields. That has happened 4 times in the period of time from the beginning of keeping crop records around 1864 up to the present time. And all of the volatile periods are 25 years in length. And the periods of consistent yields are 18 years in length. This past year was the first year of what would be the beginning of the next 25 years of highly volatile crop yields. This is important to us. This is when risk management becomes significant. A time with high yields and poor yields is not a time to despair. It is a time to manage risk. After all, it is through managing risk and the volatility of yields that the greatest profits can be made or the greatest losses can be made. Indeed, the drought that began in 2010 in the United States had a worldwide response, not to our drought, but our drought was more a response to weather conditions on a worldwide basis. Nevertheless, in the United States, we saw harsh drought in Texas and Oklahoma, and the following year in the Corn Belt. And the drought spread to become the first significant widespread drought in the U.S. Corn Belt since 1988. And in many ways, the worst drought since the mid-50s. It had the same cause as the droughts we had in the 50s. The 1950s had the strongest La Nina event since we've been keeping records of those things, about 130 years. And the most significant one in the 50s had 4 years of serious drought in the Midwest, including of course, the drought outside of the Midwest and the floods outside of the Midwest. But we think about the pattern we've seen of short-term and long-term drought. You can see an explanation on the chart of long-term drought, still at this time covering much of the country, and of short-term drought, beginning to diminish as it appears at the present time. Yet the National Drought Map still showing a great area that is considered droughty. This is a risk for 2013, especially the long-term drought, long-term where the rivers are low, city water supplies from wells are low, transportation up the great rivers, the Missouri River as it takes off from the Mississippi, and the Mississippi River above the point where the confluence with the Ohio River is low and not able to carry the traffic of grain down the river, fertilizer up the river, and normal river traffic. This will remain a problem until the agricultural drought is completely corrected. Will the agricultural drought be corrected in 2013 or will it not? The soils are scant on water. The crops last year and the year before drew much of the water out of the top 5 feet of soil, the average rooting depth for crops. Then we had 2012 with deeper than average rooting depth, and they drew the water deeper, down 7 feet, 8 feet, 9 feet in some cases. It will take 16, 18 inches of water absorbed in the soil to correct the agricultural drought before the long-term drought affecting the rivers begins to correct. These are problems that we are facing and significant risks that we face in this year. When we look at these examples of drought, we see that this past year is one of the 3 driest years since 1950. The water year begins October the 1st, because any precipitation falling after the 1st of October is considered precipitation for the next year. And this was low. It was even lower during the drought year of 1988, and slightly lower than that during the serious drought years of the mid-1950s, 1956 being the lowest precipitation year for the Midwest. Each of these years comprised several years when we look at the precipitation for every year. We were below the trend, or at the trend, the year before the serious drought in the mid-80s, and then the serious year, and the next year was below average, and finally we were above. When we look back to the 50s, we had the same situation, a below normal year for moisture, the bad year, and then another full 2 years to return to normal precipitation. It's almost folly to think that we will recover to normal during 2013. We would expect it to take 1 to 2 years. And with the soil moisture below usual, this adds a great risk to having crops at high yields. We do anticipate then that in our outlook for 2013, 4 primary things. First, increased possibility of having harsher winters over the next 20 years because of the cycle of the weather we go through. Second, less than full recharge of the subsoil, making water available to plants during weeks of high temperatures and low precipitation, for example. An El Nino during the growing season is not probable, and El Ninos are the friend of the Midwest farmer, generally speaking. When an El Nino was going on, the chance of having an above-trend yield is about 70%. With its opposite, the La Nina, which is tending to dominate this last few years, the chance of being below trend is 70%. With all things considered, it appears that Midwest crops for 2013 will likely be better than in 2012. Not in every case, but for the Corn Belt as a whole, but better, yet still not up to the trend level, which would be approximately 160 bushels to the acre for the Corn Belt average. So at this time, the odds would say below the 160, above the yields of 2012, which was 123.4 bushels to the acre. Somewhere between there, maybe around 147, if we had to make a guess. The next time we have more information on the weather patterns, we will come up with a tighter range that we expect the yields to be in. That will likely be in mid-March. In the meantime, we plan for a year that does have significant risk. This is the time to begin to exercise all of the risk management that you have learned how to do and put it into practice. This is the time to anticipate we are coming into another 25-year period of some years with great yields, some years with yields cut almost in half. And risk management will become essential to the success of farming, but it could be your most profitable years.